Thank you for that, Carla. My personal take-homes from that were understanding the whakapapa of a contaminant for my professional practice, and then also the concept of radical collaboration. Our next thought leader for the day is not here in person. She'll be presenting via video. Her name is Tiahni Adamson. She was the 2024, or is the 2024 South Australian Young Australian of the Year. She is a climate justice public speaker, a community engagement officer, and a wildlife conservation biologist.
Kapu megi batanga or kapu kut, good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time of day it is. My name is Tiahni Adamson. I'm a Karareg woman descended from Weyburn or Thursday Island in the Torres Strait. I'm an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander woman. I have a deep connection with country, and I'm really excited to share this knowledge with you, and thank you so much for giving me this voice, and I really appreciate it. I'll be speaking about water is life and a few ideas about my understanding of water and water governance from a First Nations perspective and our rights, and then planning for an equitable future that regenerates country, First Nations first. So it's kind of a two-part presentation. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people need to be advised that this presentation may contain images of people who have passed away. Most of these images are pictures that I've taken on country myself, other than one that I've put is from ABC North of a picture up in Zendakez, the Torres Strait. I'd like to acknowledge country. I understand that you're meeting in Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, so I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging in this beautiful Ngunnawal and Ngambri country that you're meeting on. That place always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to acknowledge the country that I'm on, the ancestors and the future ancestors of the Nakatish people. I'm in Washington, DC right now in the United States, doing a program, an international exchange leadership program for women in STEM called Hidden No More, which is an absolute privilege and honour to have been selected for. It's really important that we continue to acknowledge country. The lens that we have as First Nations people is really special. The way that we understand the world, the way that we understand the environment and people and culture as a living ecosystem mixing together with plants and animals, where we see ourselves not on a hierarchy or above nature, but equal to. So we know that if we destroy the water or the land or life, that we destroy that of ourselves. And it's really important that we acknowledge our traditional owners and think about the lens that we have as First People. So water is integral to the survival of us First Nations people, for whom rivers and creeks have had long and great cultural significance. Our maps, our language boundaries, our ceremonial practices, our dreaming stories and our sense of spirituality and our knowledge systems are frequently based on or oriented around the water. But after the invasion of Australia and the colonial history, our deep connection to the land, water and country has been somewhat ignored and disregarded. Our First Nations boundaries of our understanding of country often aligned well with how the water moved within the landscape, but the political and economic structure of the way that Australia is today cuts across catchment boundaries, which makes it difficult for the way that we see water and water law. We're in a climate crisis at the moment, and Australia's recurring droughts are only going to get worse as a result of climate change. So the fight over water and water rights and our sense of connection and identity to water worsens as our climate crisis worsens. The dispossession of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land is therefore also the dispossession of our water. And over the latter part of the 20th century, there's been a growing recognition for reconciliation and justice with First Nations people across Australia. So it's a really exciting time to do things differently. Indigenous water rights in reserved water rights should include and account for the separation of cultural and economic water allocations, and where water management is being conducted by First Nations people on behalf of the government in distinct environmental water allocations. The concept and understanding of First Nations water rights is absolutely not new, and it's directly related to the human rights agreement that the Australian government has ratified already. According to these existing agreements, as First Nations people, we have rights to traditional lands, which includes our water and our mineral resources for cultural, social and economic purposes. The voices of our First Nations people need to be at the centre of water plans and of catchment management as well, and we need to be able to establish a First Nations water right as a category in Australia's water management system, and then embed those rights in terms of justice and perhaps a treaty for our people too. Climate change is the biggest current threat facing humanity and the existence of our planet and all beings that live here. We know that climate change is driven anthropogenically or by human beings, and we know that First Nations communities are affected the worst by the climate crisis while contributing the least to greenhouse gases and the climate crisis. We also know that since time immemorial, every grain of dirt, animal and plant was nurtured by First Nations people with intricate care and intention. Over the last 236 years, this country in Australia has faced massive trauma in a variety of ways, where we have quite a dark history in terms of massacres and rape of our First Nations people, murder, the White Australia policy, dog tagging, slavery, the stolen generations, incarceration, forced removal of children from our families. Culture, language and law was seized because it was made illegal to do so, and practicing our culture and revitalising culture was a punishable offence. In this process, care for country by our people was also prevented, and our ability to look after our land and water was taken away from us. Our landscape and our people have had a very long-standing relationship, and that relationship has somewhat been taken away, and we're paying the consequences of that now. Yet still, the consequences don't affect all equally, and in fact, the divide keeps growing in the environment space. Our community members are still left suffering and are often left behind. However, we're not a charitable cause to mourn for. We're the longest standing, most resilient culture and nation on earth. We're not the problem, we're actually the solution. A beautiful quote from Zenda Kez: "Our oceans are rising and so are we. Our perspective has lacked in these spaces, and our perspective is absolutely needed." I'm speaking to you, a room full of absolutely wonderful experts, and each of you have a wealth of knowledge. The most recent IPCC report stated that there is a more than 50% chance that global temperatures will reach or surpass 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2040, and newer data says that that will probably be about 2.4 degrees. And under a high emissions world, the world may hit this threshold before 2037. To put this projected amount of warming into perspective, the last time global temperatures exceeded 2.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels was more than 3 million years ago. When we plan for a better future that nurtures human beings and the environment, we need to look towards regenerative futures. Regeneration aims to restore, renew and revitalise natural systems, and sustainability and thinking about sustainably operates within these constructs that still damage the earth but at a slower rate. So we really need to think about what regeneration means, how our relationship with land and water is one that cycles giving back and taking, so a regenerative approach instead of the sustainability. The goals of regenerative planning are really important and critical to how we can manage and look at country. This includes thriving ecosystems, circular economies, renewable energy, social equity and First Nations justice at the forefront, seats at the table, First Nations leadership and governance, and having a voice. Sustainable agriculture and food systems, resilient infrastructure, collaborative governance, education and thought leadership, holistic well-being from an ecosystem approach for all life, long-term thinking and long-term governance. As First Nations people, our plans are 100 to 500 years long, not just 4-year election cycle commitments. We need to think about that First Nations leadership. And the last little box that I think my head is in front of is policy and institutional reform. Decolonise to revitalise. Many of us human beings have inherent colonial wiring and a lack of education on First Nations culture, customs, and law. These inherent biases give us assumptions about the world that aren't true. We need to smash these biases. We need to rewire and unthink these systems that don't serve us, to renew our way of thinking, being, knowing, and doing, to have better planning for people, for the environment, and for water. This one's probably the most straightforward slide. Listen and be informed by custodians. Makes a lot of sense. This is on beautiful Narungga country. Uplift traditional wisdom, maintaining correct ownership of knowledge. We need to understand things like ISIP, intellectual cultural property, and the way that we look after, nurture, and ensure that intellectual property of First Nations people is kept with just as much importance as the way that we look at the intellectual property of businesses. We need to make sure that there's really transparent communication and understanding about this, and that the knowledge holders keep and maintain their knowledge within their communities. This is a photo that I took on beautiful Nukunu country of a cultural burn a few years ago. Inspiring future planning for country. So we need to understand who we're planning for and why, and the longevity of our plans for land management and for water. Are we planning for accessibility and equity to make things better for everybody, or are we planning for systems that are more exclusive and that obtain to the already existing privileges within our society? So in an idealistic nutshell, respect and recognise law, L-O-R-E, and L-A-W, law, history, customs, and culture. Build and foster meaningful relationships. Dadiri, that deep listening and understanding, two-way. Integration of knowledge systems with permission only, and we can look to ISIP and UNDRIP for these. Knowledge ownership, remuneration, capacity building, cultural revitalisation, long-term collaboration and commitment, empowering First Nations economies to have long-standing success, learning and adopting appropriate customs and law as guided with the right permissions, First Nations leadership and governance, and implementing that policy and institutional reform. So you can see some overlap about meaningful First Nations engagement to inform decision making with that of regenerative planning as well. For almost 240 years, First Nations people have been cut out of the management of our own country, once nurtured for thousands of years as an intelligent regenerative system. How many more years will we watch this country roar up in flames, experience chronic and severe drought, while human-made poisons and pollution choke our water, air, and soil before we give back the reins to those who know how to use them? Since colonisation, we have lacked seats at the table, and it's screwing up every aspect of our lives as we know it. Give us a voice. The onus is on each and every one of us to create a better future for our communities, for one that nurtures equity, that brings together diverse perspectives, and one that creates a better, more climate resilient, climate positive, and adaptable world. Thank you so much for this opportunity to have a chat with you. My LinkedIn is on the end here. I'm sorry that I can't be with you today. I was really hoping that I'd be able to manage both, but I couldn't with the overlapping dates of this program. So eso means thank you in my language, and I hope to touch base with you soon.